Joseph DeGrazia is an accomplished procurement and people leadership executive, currently serving as the head of contracts and procurement at Ampol, Australia's largest fuel retailer and a leader in integrated global fuel supply chains. With a diverse background spanning the energy, automotive, and property sectors, Joseph brings deep cross-industry and cross-market experience to large-scale transformation programs. Joseph, it's great to have you with us for this conversation. Welcome, and please tell us a little bit more about your background as you lead into the discussion on the topic of leveraging learnings from diverse supply relationships.
Thank you, Paul, for the opportunity today. And it's great to be able to talk about diverse supply relationships. It's something that's, I'm very passionate about, both at Ampol and at every company I've been at. And why I'm passionate about it is because, as I say to my teams, it's a great opportunity for us through the procurement team to actually help, improve reconciliation targets, by doing our job. So it's not often that we get that chance. So today I really wanted to talk about, I guess, my view on how we can leverage these relationships, but also most importantly, what the procurement team can do and the function can do in terms of, bringing it to life and making it a strategic enabler for organizations. From my background, coming from an automotive background initially, my focus is always about the process, making sure that it's clear. And in every organization I've been in, I always ensure that when we talk about, social procurement or indigenous procurement, we also have that lens of making sure there's a strong process, strong targets, and a way forward and a runway forward. So that's really kind of the setting the scene for what I'll be going through in the next few slides. And just on that, I guess just as background, I really wanted to talk about, I guess, from Ampol's perspective, what we've done in the last 3 years. So, basically from a Indigenous-owned supplier perspective, what have we done differently? Why have we done it? And I guess what have been some of the learnings that we've had from that? So, to really set the scene. 3 years ago, the approach when it came to Indigenous-owned suppliers was very much a procurement-led approach. So it was unfortunately, or I guess a fact of life, that it was a tick in the box kind of mentality where, we had a reconciliation action plan that said, we needed to engage Indigenous-owned suppliers, and we had to do that as part of our RAP. Our spend was quite limited, so around the 200K mark, very much a corporate head office view of what could they do, in the office that was, I guess, an easy way of engaging an Indigenous-owned supplier. And in this case, it was a promotional items category. The business wasn't really engaged. So as I said, the procurement team were looking for opportunities, but very much in isolation. In terms of stakeholder engagement, I guess, an observation I've had in this space is, there may be, I guess, a reluctance to talk about things like, feedback on pricing or feedback on, you haven't got the best proposal for that type of activity. And then finally, as a result of not having that engagement, we had very few case studies. So I remember this particular supplier for promotional items, we kept on using that for a number of years to explain our story. So we had no diversity, I guess, in our experience. So that's really setting the scene. So I guess when I came in 3 years ago, I thought about, well, that's not good enough. What are we going to do differently? So there's a few things that we did to evolve our approach. One was actually to talk to what we call our contract owners. So they're the people in the business that engage with the suppliers, from a performance perspective, from a day to day, and really kind of, bring them on this journey. And the reason why we did that is at the end of the day, it has to be a business-led decision to select a supplier. So procurement can facilitate, we can help support the strategy, but the business has to live with the outcome and the consequence of that sourcing decision. So that was kind of that focus. And how we did that was education. So we talked about, the type of suppliers that are out there in the Indigenous business sector, where are they, their footprint, etc., etc. So as a result, you can see that the scale of spend went up significantly. So last year we achieved $5 million. This year we're at 2.93 across 17 suppliers. And most importantly, they are across multiple categories. So cleaning, logistics, facilities, management, and merchandise. So you can see that, as a result of, I guess, just changing the framework, we already had that diversity in spend. Um, what was interesting for me was language. So, we hear about Indigenous suppliers, Aboriginal businesses. We made a very targeted effort to change to Indigenous-owned. And one of the reasons behind that was, unfortunately, there is sometimes a perception that an Indigenous-owned business should be 100% Indigenous-owned people. And that's just not possible. When we look at population statistics, Indigenous people only, in most areas are 3 to 4% in the metro area. So I think it's just changing that language that also helped. Also, in terms of commercial maturity, so as I alluded to before, what we found was that reluctance to actually give commercial feedback to the Indigenous-owned suppliers. So where we invited a supplier to, participate in an RFP or provide a proposal, we actually gave them feedback as we would to any other supplier. So be it commercial, be it on delivery, or performance expectations. So that was, I guess, a maturity uplift from a procurement perspective. Business benefits. So what was really interesting for me is Ampol, we are a supplier to clients. And in, most of the key tenders that we participate in, we get asked about, be it social procurement or Indigenous business engagement. And sometimes that score can be 5 to 10% of the tender. So we actually, have seen an uplift in our tender scoring, and we're able to now win or retain work. And then finally, as I said, the case study. So what I find really powerful is, the fact now that we have, those 17 suppliers that are in our supply chain, and we actually can talk to that now, be it internally and also externally. So I guess in summary, we really evolved our approach to, we're doing this because it delivers business benefits, be it in the B2B space, winning work. We do it because obviously we want to improve reconciliation outcomes. And Supply Nation says that for every dollar we spend with an Indigenous business delivers around $4.43 in social benefit into the Indigenous community. But then finally, I think what's most important is, we select these businesses because they are the best business. They are the best supplier in order to satisfy that goods and service. And I think using those 3 points has meant that, we've delivered a significant increase in spend, but also, it will be something that will remain, in the long term. And I think that's really the key for me is it has to be sustainable. It has to be business led, and it has to be commercial. So that's kind of painting the picture of I guess, our journey, Paul. In terms of a case study, I just wanted to go through, I guess, a spotlight on a company called Aboriginal United Services. So they're based in Perth in Western Australia. I think, as context, Ampol, we deliver fuel to our service stations across Australia, but we also then deliver fuel to customers in the mining sector. So I guess the business need in this space was in the Pilbara, Roy Hill, our client. We needed to expand our carting capacity. So basically transport of fuel from our terminal to the Roy Hill site. The challenge in that area is obviously it's quite remote, it's quite regional, and it's, the diversity of suppliers isn't there. So we had one supplier that we were using, and we really wanted to find an additional one. So I guess what we did was, that classic procurement supplier identification process. We looked at Supply Nation, but also internally we spoke to people within the team, and in this case, George McLeod, who's the head of our terminal business, had dealt with a supplier called Oz Services at a previous company. So we did the vetting, we spoke to them, and we understood what their capacity was. And what we found is that, initially we didn't probably have that confidence that Oz would be able to, do the full 100% of the cartage. Um, we put them through our standard accreditation process. But what we did was for a period of time actually just give them 30% of the volume. And I think it's really important in the procurement space for us to think about how do we build capability when we do want to, in this case, resolve a risk issue. And this is a really good example of, splitting our vendor load so that Oz would be able to, I guess, develop, learn, get the experience, but also not give them the 100% and put that pressure on them. In terms of governance and support, so as I said, we did put them through our standard carrier agreement. So we ensured that they were treated as per all of our carriers. But we also gave them that, I guess, experience of dealing with a large corporate like Ampol. So we put in the performance reporting, we did the benchmarking, and that also helped Oz develop as a business. So the feedback we had from them was it was great that we got an insight into how to operate at an enterprise level, how to operate in that rhythm, and it would help them as a business, in terms of potentially winning other work, but also then working with Ampol ongoing. I guess the outcome for me was really interesting. It resolved and solved that risk issue that we had in terms of a monopoly supplier. But it also then introduced a Indigenous-owned supplier into the Pilbara that actually had connections with people in the Pilbara. So the owners of the traditional owners of the supplier actually had connection into the area. So I guess it really reinforced, I guess, Ampol's connection to the customer, the business, but then also from a social perspective, it was seen that Ampol was doing something with a supplier in the area. Overall, the performance was excellent, and it also helped Roy Hill with their own wrap. So what was interesting for me is that, we had that obligation, or I guess that task within our own wrap to engage, but also so did Roy Hill. So it also supported them in that space. So a very quick overview of a case study. I think from my perspective, it really shows how procurement can help the business, solve a problem, but at the same time, support supplier diversity, and achieve both outcomes, Paul.
It's an excellent case study, Joseph. So thank you so much for sharing that. And it's not always common, particularly corporates, but also government organisations are as happy to be as open and transparent in the journey. So you've spoken about some of the challenges and the way that you strategized and resolved that. Now, this video and these materials are obviously going to be for the benefit of our University of Queensland diploma and advanced diploma students, as well as our Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply students as part of AcademyGlobal being the approved study centre and centre of excellence. And with that in mind, many of our students are going to be struggling with this question right now. So particularly for our public sector students, they're working in environments where there's formal policy, often developed by policy specialists with the best of intentions, increasingly with targets against that, but operationalizing it is so often the challenge. So I like the way that you started with the business problem first. This is not something of let's do some sort of window dressing that we're extending our wrap into supply chains. And the engagement of presumably a senior executive in George McLeod to get his buyership into solving this real problem is, I think, a really interesting part of your case study. The other thing that stuck out for me in this as well, and if you could expand on this, Joseph, this would be really helpful, I think, for our group, is that it seems like you were reticent to change too much about the commercials to try to accommodate perhaps that lower level of experience that Oz had. But you reduce risk to Ampol as well as to them to ensure that they weren't burdened initially with the whole contract. So you weren't setting them up to fail. But when it came to the contractual elements, there's an expectation that they would need to work within that sort of commercial framework and contractually. So there was a bit of give, but there was also some expectation that when it comes to the commercials that would need to hold. Can you explain a little bit about that conversation? Was that a difficult thing to negotiate with them? And were there any other parties involved in that journey in terms of their legal advice? Did they have the general counsel to assist in that process? Anything more on the complexion of that would be really interesting, I think, for our learners.
Yeah, look, really good questions, Paul, and it's something that I see quite often where I guess there is a reluctance to support a supplier that may not be at that level. So there's a couple of things to add color on. And so I should have called out, we actually engaged Oz as a subcontractor initially through Linfox. So we actually gave them that on the ground experience as a subcontractor before we then allocated the 30%. And again, we did that to build up that experience, build up that capability. So then when we did deal with them directly, they already had been on the books. And that's something that I really encourage where, it's okay to bring someone on as a subcontractor. I think it's actually sometimes better to do that for a new supplier, be it Indigenous or non-Indigenous owned. In terms of, I guess, that capability build when it came to the contracts, yes, whilst we, put that obligation of, here's the standard contract, this is how we're going to engage, we did sit down with them and probably gave them more time than we would another supplier. However, at the same time, we have non-Indigenous suppliers that are new to the business, and we do the same, right? So again, no special treatment. We did it as we would with any new supplier that's onboarded. It's really hard to bring on a new supplier in any organization. And with Oz Services, we gave them that treatment. There's probably a couple of things that I'd like to add as well. What was, I guess, a pivot that we've done as a procurement team is also, um, we call it normalize engaging Indigenous businesses. So what I mean by that is, when we engage a supplier like Oz Services, we talk internally about them being, a supplier that provides this service. We don't refer to them as they are an Indigenous-owned business. And so what I've noticed coming in was that was very apparent. People would, in the procurement team would go, we have an Indigenous-owned business that we want to engage. And I think my concern or my observation was by calling them that, we're already putting, I guess, a perception out there that one, we may need to deal with them because they are Indigenous owned. Two, because we have a RAP and a policy to do that. And three, we're going to be giving them special treatment, Paul. So as a team now, when we do have an Indigenous business participate in an RFP or we're talking to them, we actually just call them by their name because my view is we don't call a non-Indigenous owned business a non-Indigenous owned business. So that was something that the feedback we got from the sector was, you know, normalize it, talk to us as you would any other supplier. And what we found is that also takes away, I guess, any perception or any unconscious bias internally. Um, at some point, we may call out the fact that they are Indigenous owned, be it part of a strategy or endorsement document. But in that engagement, in that presentation, we really don't make it a big deal, Paul. And I think that's really helped as well. From my perspective, they have to be the best supplier, right? And that's kind of the mantra that we've taken through this, I guess, uplift and evolution.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point to make. And I think the other observation that dawned on me throughout your presentation was the perhaps unexpected benefit that in the case of Roy Hill, this was able to help them further and demonstrate their reconciliation action plan or RAP plan as well. And that was probably not something I imagine that was necessarily recognised or intended from the get-go, but what a nice further development. And the other thing, I guess, that you called out, which was probably a little bit more predictable, was throughout this process, as Oz Services developed They were developing the skills, the expertise, the knowledge of what it's like to deal with a global, sophisticated organization like Ampol, and and just develop that confidence in their own business development and their own engagement with other large complex organizations like yours. Have you noticed or observed through Oz Services any changes or development in the way in which they're developing their business, just as a matter of interest, as an observer with one of your now key contractors?
Yeah, look, we have seen that, I guess, change or I guess uplift in how they approach opportunities. So, actually, I spoke to them yesterday about another piece of work, and they came prepared with a presentation addressing, I guess, their capability in a different space. The team, were ready to present, and if I think back to our initial discussions, they weren't at that level. They didn't have the presentation ready. They didn't understand what we needed. So even in the way that they pitch for work, Paul, I've seen that. So I think that's obviously a part of that development of who they are as a supplier, but also I guess as you said, what a corporate client like Ampol expects. It's a very different world to a locally based supplier or customer in WA. We have high expectations when it comes to talking about your capability, talking about who you are. So I've seen that from, I guess, a pitch perspective. In terms of performance and how they're engaged to do the work, their performance, as it says here, has been excellent. The feedback has been very positive, and a very challenging environment. The Pilbara and that area, hard to find people, hard to find drivers, hard to get the work done. But the feedback from the business has been they've delivered, they've performed. So I think that's really kind of addressing your point about how they evolved as a supplier. I would say the answer is they've definitely improved as a result of this engagement.
Excellent. That's an excellent case study and a good news story in an area where um, I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure you've observed this across other commercial organizations, not everybody's been able to get the formula right. And the strategic approach that you took, the realistic approach, helping to set them up for success initially as a subcontractor and then as a principal contractor with a portion of the overall work, and the steps you've talked us through in this discussion has been extremely informative. So Joseph, thank you very much indeed for sharing that on behalf of our students. That's brought some great learnings for us. Thank you.
Great, Paul, and thank you for the opportunity again.